I'll wait for a few more people to arrive. Everyone, it's just about 3 o'clock. I'm just going to wait another 30 seconds or a minute to get started, just to let a few more people come in to the room, and then Devin and I will get started. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon. This is session 1 of 2 sessions that we're offering, focusing on digital accessibility and compliance and building LEA capacity. My name is Elise Crossland, and I am a senior researcher at American Institutes for Research and part of AIR's team on the Center on Technology and Disability, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Devin Wellington. Devin, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. We're really excited about presenting to you today.
So just quickly, I want to give everybody a quick introduction to the Center on Technology and Disability. We are a technical assistance center focused on increasing capacity of families, school systems, TA providers, SEA and LEA leaders, and other stakeholders in education to help them understand, acquire, and better implement appropriate assistive and instructional technology for people with disabilities. CTD is led by FHI 360, and we're a partner with them at American Institutes for Research. We also work with the Pacer Center, Adirondack, and Adirondack Accessibility. AIR's mission in the work on CTD is to focus on state and local education leaders, and so this is part of that work that we've been doing to help fill CTD's overall mission. We're funded by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. So we want to start off today with a quick overview of accessibility, what we mean by that, what some of the guidelines are, and who these accessibility issues affect, how people with disabilities use the web, and then we'll get deeper into showing what some of these things look like, specific things that you can help your LEAs with to help them build more capacity in this area. And as we go through, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and Devin or Marcelino will interrupt me and let me know. So what do we mean when we talk about accessibility? Because we talk about it a lot, and especially recently, it's become a really hot topic in K-12 education. And at its most basic, we're talking about equal access and equal opportunity to be able to access content, programs, resources, and learning platforms. One of the ways that we are often used to thinking about accessibility is with regard to curriculum content. We're used to thinking about students and accessibility, but this issue also involves parents who are using our materials, other stakeholders in our communities that may be coming to our school or district websites, especially as more and more of the work that we do as educators happens online. More and more students are coming online and accessing videos and course resources. There's a whole new world of accessibility that we really need to be thinking about. And one of the ways that we can talk about that is the things that are created to be digital, digital first, or it's also called born digital, should also be born accessible. So if something is creative, we're creating a document, we're creating a video to post online, and it's in a digital format, then one of the things that we need to think about is also making sure that that's built accessible from the start rather than having to go back and try to retrofit. Digital tools give us a lot of really excellent capabilities with regard to making things accessible. There's a lot of free tools. There are a lot of built-in capabilities in things like Microsoft Word, things like PDFs. We can do a lot of this work a lot more easily than we used to be able to, but just because something is digital does not necessarily mean that it's going to be accessible. A lot of things are built into software now. We have things that are built into our browsers that provide some extra accessibility for us, but there are still a lot of barriers when we talk about digital content for both students and parents and their families. And this isn't something that, we wait sort of until the end and somebody in special ed has to deal with it, or, it's not, I don't really deal with this, so that's not my problem. It really becomes everybody's responsibility because there are so many pieces involved, whether we're talking about purchasing technology or teachers who are creating content, or we're getting curriculum from publishers. This is a team effort, and so it needs to involve the school, the district, agencies, boards, teachers, professors, web developers, content creators, technology coordinators, and administrators all working together and thinking about their different pieces of the accessibility puzzle. And this is probably the big why do we care that a lot of people are worried about right now is compliance issues and potential violations and OCR complaints. But we also care because it's important, and we want our students to succeed, and we want our families to be able to access the content that their students need to learn about. We want parents to be able to use our school or district websites and be able to use the systems that we're creating to help interact with teachers or help understand what their kids are doing in school. And we want our teachers with disabilities to be able to access this content. So it's both, we care because it's the law and we have to care, but we also care because we genuinely do want students and their families to be able to access our content in a way that is useful and easy for them. So one of the big things whenever we talk about this is that people immediately want to know, so what do I need to do? How do this is, I know that this is a thing that I need to worry about, but I'm not sure where to start. And a great way to get an inkling for what this looks like is to look at the resolution agreements from the Office of Civil Rights. Most of the time when you look at the agreements that OCR has come to with, whether it's higher education institutions, school districts, state education agencies, they have a very clear list of steps that the educators need to follow to address some of these accessibility issues. And they're almost without fail exactly the same every time. They need to adopt accessibility policies and procedures and make those clear. They need to conduct accessibility audits. They need to have accessibility guidelines, develop a plan and how they're going to implement that plan, make content accessible, provide training and professional development for everybody that's working with the content or technology people that are developing these things. And in many cases, not all, hire somebody to serve as an accessibility expert, to serve as an auditor to help this process along. And we'll talk about a lot of these things throughout both this webinar and the follow-up session when we start talking about strategic planning and how to make these things happen. So when we're talking about accessible content, we mean that it's content that people with disabilities can navigate, perceive, understand, and interact with. And those pieces are important because a lot of times we think about accessibility and we think about, well, can they use this? But it also may be, that the content is quote-unquote accessible in that it's accessible to screen readers, it works with assistive technology, but you haven't thought about some of the other issues that people with disabilities may have in accessing your content, whether it's overly complex text or overly complex navigation that can present challenges to people with cognitive or neurological disabilities. So we need to think about all of these things that goes beyond, visual or auditory disabilities and thinks about some of the barriers that people might have who have physical, speech, or other disabilities. And I'm not going to read every piece of this chart, but we wanted to show a little bit of what that looks like when you're starting to think about all the different types of whether temporary disabilities that somebody may have as a result of an injury that's not going to last forever, or more sort of chronic and lifelong disabilities, and what does that look like, and what are some of the barriers that people can face. We think often about, oh, okay, well, I've got to caption a video. That makes sense because somebody may be deaf or hard of hearing. Or we think about blindness or low vision, and is our content readable by a screen reader? But there can also be issues with color contrast, whether it's somebody with color blindness or with other visual impairments, that using color as the sole means of conveying information can be really challenging to somebody. If you say, look below in the red box, that doesn't give somebody with a visual impairment or with color blindness an adequate way of figuring out what you're talking about. For people with cognitive and neurological disabilities, such as seizure disorders or memory disorders or autism spectrum, as I mentioned, long and overly complex text, or things that have moving or blinking or flashing elements, or sites that have really confusing navigation, and so it's hard to figure out where you're supposed to go or what you're supposed to click on, can be really challenging and provide a significant barrier. People with speech disorders, maybe something that we won't think about, but we have a contact us on our website, for example, and we say, oh, call this number. And if that's the only way that somebody can contact us and let us know that they have an issue, then that's obviously a significant barrier. And finally, people with physical disabilities, if you have a website that I can't click through unless I have keyboard access, that can be a challenge. Having insufficient time to respond to things, there is nothing more frustrating than trying to fill out a form and it times you out or kicks you out of the form because it's taken you too long to complete it. So not something as simple as being able to save your process or having open-ended time limits on something can remove that barrier for people with physical disabilities. So I know that one thing that people always want to know about with regard to accessibility is, okay, so I kind of get what I need to do. I know that I need to do this, but what are some guidelines? How do I know what I'm supposed to be doing? How do I know what's going to make sure that our content is compliant and that our content is usable and perceivable by everybody that needs to use it and understand it? And one of the big shifts that is happening, it's been delayed a bit, but it's gradually moving in that direction in the United States, is that we're shifting to focus on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. And previously, the Section 508 was pretty much aligned to the WCAG 1.0. And we're gradually moving towards 2.0 becoming the new national standard, which is actually really great for technology people and web developers because 2.0 has become sort of an international standard in many countries. And so this gives us something that we know is being done across the board, particularly if you're an educator looking at software that is developed in another country. If it meets 2.0 guidelines, you know that it's also meeting what we're looking for in the United States. And even though the changes have been delayed, and so some people have been kind of saying, well, should we wait? Should we see if things are going to go in a different direction? It's become pretty clear from both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education that this is a high priority, and that even though there aren't new guidelines yet, that they consider accessibility of the web, accessibility of digital content to be mandatory, and that we're required to provide equal access to web-based services, programs, and activities, whether to our students or to parents, families, community members that are accessing our content through school and district websites or state education agency websites. All of those things need to be accessible. And that this goes back to the Americans with Disabilities Act that was, at the time of writing, explicitly written to keep pace with developing technologies. It was written in such a way that even though we don't know what's coming in the future, everything in the future should be considered mandatory for it to be accessible to people with disabilities. And so what are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0? The best way to really understand them is to actually go look at them, because there's very specific guidelines for a wide variety of types of content or how things work on the internet, and whether it's color contrast or how your website is set up. And so there are very clear suggestions and guidelines and standards associated with those, and Devin's going to talk a little bit more about what those look like. But the thing that's important to know is that there are 3 tiers of compliance: level A, AA, and AAA. And if we end up shifting towards 2.0, the direction from the U.S. government has been that we'll be focused on meeting compliance levels at both A and AA. AAA is really pretty advanced and not something that most websites or software developers would end up interacting with or end up needing to use. So there are 4 principles and 12 guidelines, and you can see these kind of reflect some of the things we talked about, or I talked about earlier, with perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And these talk about, once you get into those, they talk specifically about what that looks like. So this is a lot. And it's not something that you know, sort of state leaders or even necessarily district leaders are going to be expected to fully understand the web accessibility guidelines, because even as somebody who understands technology, they're very dense. They're written, you know, mostly for people who are developing this technology and developing the content. But having a good sense for what things look like and what types of things you need to pay attention to will be essential. And so one of the things that will be your role and sort of who is responsible for this is that everybody will have a piece of it. Teachers will not need to understand, again, the full breadth of the Web 2.0 accessibility guidelines, but they will need to know if I'm creating content, if I'm making a Word document or a PDF for my students, or I'm making a video for my class, what do I need to think about and how do I do these things? How do I make sure that things are accessible? How do I test them? How do I make sure that the colors I'm using for my class website are not going to be a barrier to somebody with a visual impairment or somebody with color blindness? Web developers that we're working with as we're going forward and developing school and district websites, they need to be aware of this. And if they don't know anything about accessibility or they're not familiar with the guidelines, they either need to learn or we need to make sure that we're bringing on web developers for our projects that do understand this and do know that this is something they need to think about. And that includes technology coordinators need to think about this as they're thinking about purchasing technology and making sure that we ask vendors whether technology is accessible to our students with disabilities. And finally, administrators need to understand this and be part of setting this as a priority, whether it's building-wide or system-wide at the school district level or statewide, and saying that accessibility and thinking about these things is a high priority for everybody. One of the ways that we can get there is by being proactive. It's much harder and much more expensive and much more challenging to go back and try to fix something later that is inaccessible than to start from the beginning and say, what do we need to do? Who is using our content? What types of barriers might they have? And let's think through this. And that's something that requires working together. It doesn't just mean everybody in the school or in the district, but also potentially bringing in parents with disabilities or disability organizations that are in your area to talk through some of these issues and ask for help, ask for feedback, and use that information to help develop out your accessibility policies or your accessibility plan to address some of these issues. The first way to really start, if you haven't already, is to sort of plant that accessibility seed, because it is a long process. There's a lot involved, and every time technology changes, we're going to have to think about this again. Whenever there's a new technology, there are inevitably people who get digitally excluded because they have a disability, nobody thought through it before they developed this new technology. It's not accessible for whatever reason, and then we have to go back and make these changes. So to start by making this part of everybody's language, making this part of something that everybody thinks about as part of their daily or monthly practice, that whenever I'm purchasing technology, whenever I'm writing new contracts with vendors, I make sure accessibility language is in there. I know that. I know that's my role as a technology coordinator or as a curriculum specialist. And then, classroom teachers know, I know this is part of my role to make this content accessible for all my students. And I know that if I'm communicating with parents or I'm using a classroom blog to communicate with families, I know I have to think about this and I have to make things accessible. And if I don't know how, I know who to ask to get help. So to start to plant that seed and to ask yourself as you're going through this process, and to have school leaders and district leaders asking these questions, do we have an accessibility policy posted on our website? Do our teachers know who to ask if they don't know how to make something accessible or they don't know where to go to get help? Do parents know who to ask if they come to our school district website or they come to our school website or a classroom page? Do they know who to ask if something is inaccessible? And having an accessibility policy clearly posted both internally for staff and externally for anybody that comes to your site is a really great first step, because at the very least it shows people that this is a priority, we're aware of it, we're working on it, we're thinking about it, and here's who you can contact if you need help. Being able to ask, how are people with disabilities currently using our content? And if you don't know the answer to that question, finding ways to find out, and finding out what barriers they encounter and what assistive technologies people are currently using to access your content, whether it's a school website or software or whatever. And are all of our staff aware of the need for accessibility? And if they're not, what can we do to get them there? And understanding what your primary needs and concerns are around accessibility. Some schools and some districts are going to be further along in this process than others, but being able to articulate what their concerns are and how people are currently using their sites and using their content helps you start on that process of strategic planning and saying, okay, we know what our problems are, we know what we need to address, and we know how we're going to get there. And so these are sort of a preview of some of the information that we're going to ask you to think about before you come back in January for session 2, is to think about what this looks like in your LEAs right now. And do you know? Do your districts have an accessibility policy posted on their websites? Do they know how people with disabilities, how parents and teachers and students with disabilities are using their content? And if they do know that, do they know what kinds of barriers people are encountering, or is this not even something that has come up yet? So that was a lot of talking from me. I'm going to switch over to Devin, who's going to talk a little bit more about the actual practical application of this information and training LEAs and thinking about how to provide this support and structure for them. So Devin, I'll go ahead and make you presenter because Devin's also going to show some fun things, I think, here. Devin?
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, that's okay.
I apologize. So, like Elise mentioned, in this section we wanted to talk about some resources and some practical tools you guys can use to train your LEAs. A lot of the questions we got prior to this webinar when you were signing up was related to, you know, what are some actual resources and how do we go about preparing our LEAs to do this work? How do we, what can you give us more about accessibility policies, how we do audits, what are some guidelines? So we got the sense you really wanted to dig a little deeper into the resources. And so if you bear with me, I'm going to go ahead and flip between the PowerPoint and also demonstrate some resources. I will tell you ahead of time that we wish that we could just hand you a package that says this is everything you need to know, or here's a quick step-by-step guide for making all of your content accessible. And unfortunately, we don't have that. We don't know if anyone who does. Wouldn't that be nice? But we can provide the resources, and then you can think about, like Elise said, you know, what you need to prioritize in your state, what's really issues for your districts, and at least have the resources to know where to start. So the first thing we want to talk about is accessibility statements. Like Elise mentioned, sometimes it's when it comes to at least OCR compliance or letting people in your districts or state know that at least you're considering it, right? Like even if you haven't started the process of accessibility, letting users know that you are aware that accessibility is something that needs to be addressed can be a really powerful tool. And so I'm going to flip real quick. So this is on my screen right now. You should be seeing a disabilities.gov website. And here's just a sample accessibility statement that they provided, right? And this is a really good, simple example. You can tell that it's not a hugely in-depth statement, really. It's just kind of, it will get you started. Another great resource is there's this accessibility generator. It's a statement generator, so you can come in and you can, you know, give your website name, give the URL. You can say which target level you want to be, if you want to be A or AA or AAA, how people could contact you about those issues. And then you go down here and it talks about, it shows you a little checklist of criteria that you might need to meet. And even in these little question marks, it gives you more information. So if you're like, I don't know what, I don't know if there's an alternative for all non-text content. What does that mean? You can go in here and it will give you more information. And so you can come in here and check what you do and don't have. It also has you think through, you know, what's your plan for addressing this issue. And so it works all of these considerations into your accessibility statement. And then at the end, once you go through this process, it just literally like plops out an accessibility statement for you that you can post on your website. And this actually is a great learning tool, right? So you can go through and think through some of these questions, and if you don't know the answers to them, at least you know that you need to start looking. So those are some resources around accessibility statements. Software functionality. So this is kind of one that I think is overlooked a little bit, especially as we think about training LEAs and our LEAs therefore training teachers. We know that our teachers are becoming more and more content creators. And so this is something that they need to think about too, and not even just special ed teachers, right? We know that our kids in special education are spending a lot of time in the general ed classroom. In fact, a majority of the time in the general ed classroom. And so this is something, again, everyone, you need to have a team effort on. But if they're creating, a Word file to share with their class, or a PowerPoint or a PDF, there's, really great step-by-step videos on YouTube of how to do this. And I have a quick example for you. This is a document that we recently developed and published, and it's about the Every Student Succeeds Act. It has nothing really to do, with what we're talking about today. But you notice that if I go here to the very top, I've used a heading, right? I've used a structure that's already embedded within Word. And when I go here and I do a table, I've used a table tool. And it sounds so simple, but when it comes to using a screen reader, when it comes to developing a table of content, all of these things become really important for our users, and especially those with disabilities. And sometimes what you'll see people doing is, instead of using a bullet, which is built in, you'll see them do a million spaces, right? And on a screen reader, that reads as space, 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 which isn't necessarily going to be the best experience for your user. So there are accessibility features built into these programs. You can also do within Word, you can do an accessibility checker. You can check in here, and it will help you figure out some of the issues that you might be able to easily resolve to make the document more accessible. And that's in PowerPoint, that's in PDF. All of those tools have these already built in. And then I actually wanted to show you this page real quick. So this is a really great page from CAST for best practices for educators and instructors. And again, this is some resources you can see on the screen here, for how to make some of this content accessible. But they have so much more than just what was on my little screenshot. So, they have, policy. It talks about policy issues. It has information on creating digital content. It has information on social media best practices, right? We know that even in schools and states that social media is becoming a way that we communicate to everyone. Schools have social media accounts, and so it talks about how to make those accessible, which is sometimes often I would say, not sometimes, often overlooked. And so there's information about state and federal accessibility guidelines. And so there's a ton of resources already available that can help you think about, maybe you want to do professional development for your LEAs. These resources are a great place to get started. Another consideration is color, right? So some considerations to think about with color is that it shouldn't be the sole means of conveying meaning. And there's certain colors to avoid, like red and green. It can often be really difficult for those who are colorblind or low vision, and even color contrast, right? So I'm going to take you to this WebAIM site that just allows you to really quickly do a color contrast checker, and I'm going to kind of show you what that looks like. We recently developed an infographic as a resource and went in to I went in to check to see if the colors we used were accessible, right? And so this foreground color is white, and then I use the background color, so our text is white and our background color is like a dark, dark blue, right? And I can go in here and I can see this is exactly what that would look like. And it passed in both the color and in large text. Okay, so this will tell you right away if you have a teacher creating something, some content, if you have your web developer creating content, this is a really easy way to go in and check to see if that meets the needs for people who are low vision or who might have other issues with colors. And so another color that we used on the infographic was this nice light blue. I thought it looked really pretty, and it failed, right? Both of those measures. So maybe you might have text that is, you know, the colors fail, but is large enough that it might make up for the color contrast, right? So there's a bunch of different considerations to be made when thinking about color contrast. And again, this is such an easy way to think about, you know, your students with disabilities, your parents who might be trying to access your district website or other content. And this is a really great and easy way to support them and to support accessibility. Another thing, and Elise mentioned this as well, is cognitive accessibility and, you know, how we're presenting the information. So turning large chunks of text into more manageable sections, or shortening sentences, or this one again is a really easy fix of using a sans serif font and instead of a serif font. So serif font would be this Times New Roman right here. You can see it has the little structural details, as they say, on the edges. Sometimes can actually be more difficult for people with cognitive or learning disabilities to process visually. And so how easy is it to advise your LEAs or your teachers to use a sans serif font, right? So again, it's a really quick, easy fix. Okay, so alt text is required, as alternative text is required for graphics, pictures, charts, things that aren't necessarily text content, right? So this picture I have here of this alt text, this is, even though you see text right here, this is an image that I took, right? So a screen reader wouldn't read this. And so there's some basic guidelines around alt text, and I can even show you, if you want, in PowerPoint, like how you do this, right? Like I could go in here and I would go here and I'd format this picture, and right here, this is where I add my alt text. Right, you'll see right here I put alt, and this is called null, N-U-L-L, null. This picture right now is not conveying meaning, content, right? I have all this other text in this area that really is the crux of what I'm talking about. But if I were just to be here with this screen up and only describing what would need to happen in this without the accompanying text that was on the previous slide, then this would need much more in-depth alt text. And so there's actually a really great resource about how to write effective alt text for images. It's on this website called Web Credible. And it goes through, you know, kind of each way that you could address needs for alt text, or how to best put it in. Again, it talks about this null alt text. Not everyone uses it for spacer images, is what they're calling them. And so again, this is decorative images. You have to think about, does the image provide context? If it does, that changes the need for alt text. Is it just pretty, right? Then you might not need to describe it in alt text, and there's better ways to describe it than others. So a lot of times what I've seen is, you know, someone will have an image like this, and they'll put in the title, and the alt text will both say alternative text. Like they'll just kind of take the title for the image, and that's not really helpful if that's the only image on the page that people are seeing and that's being described. So you have to think about the context, and I mean, if it's a picture of a field of lilies because you like that picture, if it's a picture of a field of lilies because you're you know, providing curriculum about biology and how lilies, you know, reproduce, it's going to be a different experience and different meaning. So there's also captions and described videos, and you know, like I talked about how a lot of kids in the special education programs are spending most of their time, or a lot of their time in general ed classrooms. We find that people who are using tools for those who might need them for accessibility are actually, everyone's benefiting from them, right? So with Captions is a great example of this. people who don't need the captions oftentimes report and have been shown to learn and digest more when their captions are on. It's just another way to reinforce the material that's being, what's the word I'm looking for? The material that's being presented. So also video content should include a transcript, and then even if there are captions, it's helpful for videos to be described for people who can't see them. So closed captions, or with caption videos, we often think of people who are deaf or hard of hearing needing to read what's happening, but also videos for people who aren't able to see them, they'll also need to be described, such as, you know, the man is opening a door and walking into this room, and simple things like that. So really quickly to show you this, I'm going to play you a quick clip. I won't show you the whole thing, but this is a really, really great video because it shows how interactive and how accessible videos can be beyond captioning. So if I go ahead and I hit play, there's also options to hide the captions or show them. Right here I can show the transcript of the video, and then I'll show this to you, I'll demonstrate this, but this is, I can speed it up or slow it down. So for those who might want the video to go a bit slower for processing, this is a great example that that's even an option, right? So if we start this here, I don't know that you guys can hear the sound on this right now, but I can speed it up. I can slow it way down. And so you can see at the bottom it tells you how fast it's going. I can hide these captions. I can add them. So this is, again, like our kind of star shining example of the best ways. Oh, and you also have audio description down here. The best way to caption a video. But even if you don't hit every single thing, you don't have to slow up or speed up and slow down. You know, basic captioning or transcripts should be on all of your videos. And there's really, I mean, you can go into YouTube and watch a tutorial in YouTube about how to add captions in YouTube, right? So meta. So there's a lot of really great resources, and this is, again, something that should be done every time. And if you kind of build it into your process of developing content, then it just becomes second nature. Also, we need to consider descriptive hyperlinks. So sometimes on a website you'll see something like click here, or even in accessibility statements, like if you need, if you want to discuss accessibility or get these resources in a different way, please click here or please email, and then this will be hyperlinked. And that's not useful a lot of times for people who have accessibility needs or using screen readers. So I'll go ahead and show you this site really quick. This talks a lot about how to make hypertext links or links accessible. One of the other considerations, which I'm happy to mention here, is keyboard accessibility. So if you have something that says click here and it's actually really, you can only physically click on it to access that link, that's not accessible. They also have to be accessible through keyboards. So again, this is a great example of a good resource that if this is something you want to focus on and prioritize, or even just get started on, this is a great resource to do that. This is also a really good site for developers, right? So like Elise mentioned, our web developers and our technology administrators have to be in on this. And so CAST developed this website, CAST Figuration, that is specifically for developers and developing accessible websites. So it, like this says, you know, helps developers build accessible cross-device interactive, so devices or websites that are responsive across devices and accessible across devices. And that can be accessed via mouse, keyboard, touch screen, and consider all of these things: color, column, and grid layout. So with all of these new responsive websites that look really pretty, is it still in a new responsive layout? Is it still accessible on a mobile device compared to maybe a laptop computer or a PC? You know, how functional are your menus and your tabs? Those are all things to consider. So we go in here, the CAST website, sorry about this, I'll just take you to this front page, is something that your developers, your tech team can download. And then they can kind of poke around here. It talks about the different components, utilities, all of these really great resources for making your websites accessible. And I don't know necessarily what all of this means, but I'm sure your tech team and your developers will. And then finally, we did want to include, we have some training resources, as well as you'll see at the end of this, a lot of resources for you to get started and to explore. You'll also see in the handouts, tab on the GoToWebinar panel on this side, we have 5 downloadable resources for you to access right now, and that we think that would really benefit you. And we've developed these with states and local leaders in mind. So Elise, I can go ahead and turn this back over to you if you want to go through and finish us up here.
Sure. Thank you. All right, and so also I just want to check. I know Devin and I have gone over a lot of information. First of all, we'll send you all these slides after the webinar, along with a link to a quick survey about the webinar. But you can have these slides. You can feel free to cut them apart and use them, pull things out for specific trainings with LEAs or for meetings or discussions. These are resources for you, as well as the handouts that are in the sidebar there that Devin just called out. And we are working on a few additional new resources, one for teachers and one for web developers that we will, once those are finalized, we'll be sure to pass those along. But in the meantime, we've put all of these things together, and you'll have access to all of these after the webinar.
Elise, you did have a question about captions.
About captions?
Yeah, it's a great question about how do you handle videos that a site points to, right? So you might be referred to a video, and that a video that you don't have any control over is not captioned, right? You didn't create it, you don't have control over it. So it's not captioned, or it is captioned, but it's not described. I think one of the simplest things you can do on your end is to develop a transcript for it. I mean, I think it's also more than reasonable to reach out to whoever created the video and ask them to help you in making it accessible. Right? I think the more that we reach out and work with, outside sources, external parties, to be part of our team, then the more awareness it brings to issues about accessibility. But I think at the very least, if needed, if they're not cooperative, if you develop at least a transcript, and that transcript can also have descriptive content in it, I think that's a good place to start. Elise, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it depends, too, on what the video is being used for. But, for example, if it's a video that is required viewing for all the students in a class, for example, and this is how some higher ed folks got in trouble because they were, especially professors will assign videos or have online learning components, and, they were having students who were deaf complaining, saying, well, I have to do all this extra work now because this video that I'm required to watch for my course is not captioned, and I have to go and try to meet with the professor and try to find another video that is captioned that might have some of the same information. So being able to address those issues up front, if it's required viewing for a student, making sure that the teacher understands, for example, that all those videos need to be accessible. If they're going to ask their students, or if they can't find an accessible video that shows exactly what they want to show, to have some sort of alternative for the student, whether it's reading a transcript as Devin suggested. If it's not, quite as essential, then there are certainly other ways of showing the information, and like Devin said, reaching out to the creator of the video. I mean, the nice thing is that YouTube does have sort of an auto caption feature. It's not perfect. Quite often it's really awful in places, but it does a pretty good job of using speech to text and creating captions. So in a pinch, that also will work. It won't always be entirely accurate. But the ideal is to reach out to video creators and say, look, we really want to use this as part of our classroom learning, or we want to use this on our state website, but it's not accessible and that's a problem. Can you work on fixing that? Okay, let me get back to my slides here. So one of the things we wanted to talk about is, after you've sort of gotten all this information, which is a lot to digest, are what are some action steps that you can now take and that your LEAs can be taking to start this process or to carry on further, even if you already have started this process, to carry on a bit further with it. And so one of the first things is to really be able to learn more about your users with disabilities and how they're currently using your content and the barriers that they're experiencing. And if you don't know the answer to any of those questions, or the LEAs that you work with don't know the answer to any of those questions, then that gives you a big clue where to start, because you really can't start addressing accessibility and fixing issues without really understanding who the people are that are using your content. And that leads really nicely into this concept of personas. And that personas are used a lot in web development. They're a development tool to think about possible future users of a website or of a software product or a hardware. And what they are is they're fictional representations of your typical user. And one of the ways to really get this to be part of everybody lives and breathes and thinks about accessibility is to borrow this concept of personas and think about who are my students and who might be trying to access this content that I'm creating, or who are the families in our community, the parents, the caregivers in our community, and how might they be trying to access our website or trying to access their students' homework or the classroom blog. And to create a fictional representation of, well, this student's name is Jim, and he's raised by his grandmother. And his grandmother doesn't have very good internet access at home, so she often has to use the library to do this. And his grandmother also has some visual issues, visual impairment issues, and these are the types of things that she might encounter. Well, how would we deal with that? Or this is our student who may have an auditory disability, and he's going to have to do X, Y, and Z, and how would he deal with that? And it helps you to start to think through not just about your users with disabilities, but users who may not have internet access at home, may not have access to a computer, and so are accessing everything on a smartphone or mobile device, people who may have temporary disabilities, people in your community who are elderly that are trying to access your school or district website, and it's overly complex and they're not very tech savvy and they're not familiar with these things. So it helps you to really think through a whole range of potential barriers and how you might address those from the beginning to make things more accessible to everybody. And the nice benefit of that is that it actually makes your website more accessible to and easier to use and more friendly to all of your users, whether they have disabilities or not. Another key step is to make sure that everybody that you're working with on your teams understands accessibility legislation at both the state and the federal level. A lot of states go further. Massachusetts, where I live, is one of them. They have these sort of little 508, the state level 508 guidelines, and they go a little bit further sometimes than federal guidelines with regard to accessibility or making purchasing decisions for technology at state agencies. And so making sure that your teams understand that this is a legal responsibility and what that means, what they, understanding sort of what they have to do. It's not just making sure that our content is accessible to students in the classroom, although that's a big piece of it, but it's also making sure that anything that's getting pushed out to families, to parents, to caregivers, to people living in our communities, that those things are accessible too. Using checklists and guides, some of the things that Devin showed with the WebAIM resources and WCAG 2.0 checklists are a good way to perform a quick accessibility audit of your website or of your content to see if it matches up. And there are a lot of really great free tools that can perform accessibility audits of your website. Again, they're not going to find every single mistake or every single accessibility issue that requires human interaction. There's only so much these checkers can do, but they can do a lot and help you highlight some of the big issues that might come up. But the really important thing is to make sure that you're also involving people in this process. Use checkers, use checklists, use tools, but accessibility is more than just a checklist. It's how people are actually using your content and interacting with it. So make sure that you bring in students or bring in parents with disabilities and asking them, how does this work? What barriers did you encounter? Does this work with your screen reader? And getting that kind of personal feedback. When you are, or your LEAs are purchasing technology, requesting the voluntary product accessibility template and putting statements in contracts and purchases for content that specifically relate to accessibility. And this is one of the key pieces that has come out of the OCR resolutions, is they've recommended to the schools and districts and state agencies that they've had these resolutions with, that they include specific language with vendors related to accessibility, and that puts the responsibility back on the vendor if something later proves to be inaccessible or something is not, that the vendor then has to address that problem and deal with it. So that's a really powerful thing that LEAs can do and schools can do, is to make sure they're putting that language in their contracts up front, or redoing existing contracts and putting that language in. And if you have a vendor, when you request an accessibility template or you ask them about how they're accessible, if they say they don't know, or that they aren't sure, or they've never heard of the a product accessibility template, then that's a big red flag that's probably not somebody you want to be purchasing technology from. Reviewing accessibility policies at other districts, schools, and universities is another really great step. This isn't something that every single school or every single district has to reinvent the wheel every time. It's pretty standard across the board, which is why Devin was able to show that really nice accessibility statement generator tool. The types of information that you include can be more or less depending on your situation, but they're often very similar. The same thing with purchasing and procurement policies. There's not always a lot at the K through 12 level, but a lot of universities have gone through the OCR process in the last several years, and there's several universities, I list them at the end of the slides, that have really great examples of purchasing and procurement guidelines and sample language that you can use in contracts with vendors, and sample language that you can use in forward-facing accessibility policies to put on your website. So looking at what other people have done and then modifying it for your situation is an excellent step. And as part of that, in addition to having this sort of external-facing accessibility policy, it's really important to have an internal accessibility policy that goes a bit further and really lays out that this is a commitment at the school level or at the district level, at the state level. This is an institution-wide vision of accessibility and a commitment to universal design for learning, to user-centered and user-focused accessibility planning, and that this is something we care about, and this is something that we're making a priority for everybody involved, so that it does become part of just what's expected and part of the culture of the school or the district, that no matter what, we always ask, is this accessible? Are our parents going to be able to use this? Are our students going to be able to use this? What can we do to reduce barriers? And so once you've gone through and started to develop these policies, or your LEAs have started to develop these policies, post these policies, they've worked with stakeholders, they've worked with parents and students, and an accessibility auditor potentially from the outside to come in and look at resources, it's time to really sit down and carry out your accessibility plan. And it's not going to happen overnight. Some of these things may take longer than others. Some of them may be very easy fixes. Putting a policy on your website is an easy fix. Saying going forward, everything we create, every Word document we create, we're going to make sure that everybody knows to use the headers like Devin showed and to use consistent tables. That's a pretty easy fix. Saying we've got, a library of 4,000 videos online that our students use that have been created, that none of them are captioned. That's a much bigger and more time-consuming step to go back and caption all of those videos. So part of this will be setting goals and benchmarks. And some of that may say, well, you know what, going forward, we're going to caption all our videos. From today onward, that's something that we just do no matter what. And then we're going to develop a plan for how we're going to deal with some of these old videos. And maybe some of them are from, 6 years ago. The content isn't relevant anymore, so we're just going to pull those down because they're not accessible and it's not worth our time and our money to make them so. But these ones we are going to address, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's who's responsible. And then as you're going through this work, and as your LEAs are going through this work, carry out regular accessibility audits and continue to solicit feedback from students and stakeholders. Because as I mentioned earlier, as technology changes and as new things emerge, we're necessarily going to run up against additional barriers that people didn't think about. Initially, e-readers, Kindle type things were not necessarily accessible to people with disabilities because you couldn't have the text read aloud. And so every time we introduce a new tool to our students or we introduce a new functionality to our website or some new software program that has never existed before, there may be considerations with accessibility that we haven't thought of. And so to continue to solicit feedback, having a simple form, contact, email, phone number, all of the above, on your website, where if I'm a parent using your site, I know exactly who to contact and say, I can't access this. Can I get this in a different format, or can someone help me? Allows you to continue to collect data and make sure that you're addressing accessibility issues as they arise. And so at the end of these slides here that you'll get when we send them out, we have all of these links to the tools that we've talked about and many, many more to our accessibility tools and resources. If you, in your state, are working on online learning components, or you have some elements of online learning for your students, we included some resources here about accessible distance learning and accessible online learning, as well as tools for teachers and technology coordinators and best practices for teachers and tech developers. And here I just want to point out at the end, you'll see this Temple University Guide to Accessible Purchasing. That's a really nice resource, as well as the PALM initiative, Purchasing Accessible Learning Materials. And both those sites have excellent sample language that you can pull from to create contracts or to create policies within a school or district for purchasing technology. And one of the really nice things, if you don't have this yet at the state level, is to include this kind of language on your state website so that your LEAs and schools can have a place that they know they can go to get some language to start to write into their contracts. And it makes it start to become an expectation for everybody. We don't write new vendor contracts unless this language is in it. We don't buy curriculum, we don't buy software unless we've talked about accessibility first. We don't build a new website without thinking about and asking these questions of the web developers. So that's all the content we have. I want to check and make sure that there aren't any other questions. I know this was a lot of content. The thing that we want to do is have you take this content and sort of sit with it and digest it a little bit and think about if you know the answers to some of these questions with your LEAs. Do they have accessibility policies? Are they aware of how people are using their content? How students, how parents and stakeholders are using their websites? Are they aware of existing barriers, or is this something that they haven't started to think about yet, or they have an issue that hasn't come up yet because nobody has contacted them to say this is inaccessible? Kind of start to take the pulse of what's happening in your LEAs and where they are in this process. And because that can help for our next session in January and talking about what do we know, where the districts, where the schools sitting right now, and what can we do to help support them and to help start the strategic planning process for moving this work forward. And if there are no questions, then it's about 4 o'clock, so we'll wrap up. But please feel free to email any of us, Devin or myself. In the meantime, before the next webinar if you have any questions. And we'll also be sending out these slides so that you can have access to all of these links and resources. Great. Thank you so much for, oh, sorry, Devin.
No more. No more. Sorry, I thought false alarm.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you in a couple weeks to really dig in and start talking about planning and how we can help you move your LEAs forward. Thanks a lot.